She didn't say it like it was a compliment. You've changed. She looked at you like she didn't recognize something. Like the version of you she used to control had vanished. She wasn't wrong. You had changed. But not in the way she thought. You weren't colder. You were clearer. The old you would have explained, justified, apologized for not being as available, as playful, as eager to please. But this version sat still, silent. You didn't owe her an answer, not anymore, because for the first time, you weren't performing. You weren't trying to keep her interested. You weren't worried about being misunderstood. You weren't trying to protect her feelings at the cost of your own truth. That was the shift she felt. And that's the one no one prepares you for. It doesn't happen after a breakup. It doesn't happen from reading quotes. It happens in the quiet when you finally get tired of needing things you don't respect. At first, solitude feels like a punishment. No texts, no plans, no chaos, just silence. And you. Most men panic there. They think something's wrong if they're not being wanted. But that moment, the one where no one's watching, no one's praising, no one's checking in, that's the beginning of the real man, because if you can sit in that silence and not run, you will come out someone the world won't recognize. She won't know how to handle it. She used to press your buttons. Now you've disconnected the panel. She used to predict your reactions. Now you don't react. You observe. And here's what most men never realize. Women don't fall for the man who chases them. They fall for the man they can't influence. That's what changes when you stop performing. She feels the shift, not in your words, but in your posture, your pacing, your presence. You're no longer broadcasting "pick me." You're signaling something far more dangerous: I've already picked myself. And if she fits, she fits. If not, that's fine too. Most men never reach that place. Because to get there, you have to go through detox, not from drugs, from attention, from approval, from the subtle high of being noticed. You have to starve the ego, and it screams. You'll wake up and check your phone instinctively. Did she reply? Did anyone care? Nothing. And that's when the war begins. Because now it's just you, and all the noise you buried. You start remembering the things you never processed. The failures, the fake smiles, the compromises you made just to feel accepted. You see how much of your life wasn't yours. How much of your personality was shaped to avoid rejection. You used to pride yourself on being adaptable. But all you were was afraid of standing still. Because stillness reveals truth. And if you sit in that truth long enough, something terrifying happens. You realize just how many things you've tolerated, just how many people you've let in who didn't earn it, just how many standards you lowered just to keep the peace. But that realization doesn't destroy you. It cleans you. It's a brutal kind of baptism, burning away the parts of you that were never real. And what's left is something solid. You start moving slower. You don't explain your silence. You don't ask to be understood. You're not rude. You're just rooted. And the moment a man becomes rooted in himself, people get uncomfortable. Because you've stopped adjusting, and that means they can no longer mold you. They say you've changed. What they mean is, you're no longer dependent. You're no longer predictable. You're no longer playing the game they felt safe in. They don't miss you. They miss the version of you they could control. That's the version you buried in solitude. And trust me, he needed to die. Because he wasn't built on strength. He was built on survival. But you're not surviving anymore. You're becoming. And she sees it. She sees it in your silence, in your eyes, in the way you can hold a pause longer than she can hold a stare. She sees it, and part of her respects it, even if she never admits it, because deep down, every woman tests a man hoping to feel something she can't explain: security, not in how much you need her, but in how little you need anything. That's what she calls different. That's what she says feels off. She's not wrong. She's just meeting you after the fire. And this version doesn't flinch. This version doesn't chase. This version doesn't beg to be seen. Because this version finally sees himself. You won't hear applause when it happens. No one congratulates the man who stops chasing validation. Because what you just did threatens everything around you. Your silence offends the loud. Your calm disturbs the anxious. Your focus reminds the unfocused of what they've been avoiding. Most men never become this version because they never sit long enough in the withdrawal. Approval detox isn't dramatic. It's subtle. It's that moment you almost say yes just to keep the peace, but you say no instead. It's not explosive. It's surgical. The cut is clean, but the consequences echo. You'll lose people, but you'll feel lighter. Because you're not losing connection. You're shedding dependency. That's the difference. Most men confuse attachment for love, attention for respect, performance for purpose, and it's not their fault. They were raised to believe they had to earn value from outside themselves. Be funny, be useful, be agreeable. Then maybe someone will choose you. But the moment you stop auditioning, something reverses. You stop shaping your identity around being liked, and you start shaping it around being aligned. You no longer ask, "What will they think?" You ask, "Does this feel like truth?" You stop chasing dates and start building standards. You stop seeking answers and start sharpening your questions. And when a man lives like that, the world notices. Not because you're louder, but because you're rooted. Still, unshaken. You walk into a room, and people feel something. They just can't name it. That's the presence women respond to. Not flash, not flirt, stillness, direction, precision. You don't push conversation. You don't chase attention. You don't need anyone to approve of the pace you've chosen, because everything about you says I've got somewhere to be. And I don't need to be understood to get there. That's power. But here's the part no one tells you. When you become that man, calm, grounded, clear, you will confuse people. They'll say you've changed. They'll say you're different. And they'll be right. Because you've stopped giving them access to the old version of you. The version that over-explained. The version that apologized for being busy. The version that needed to be liked before he felt valuable. That man is gone. You buried him every time you said no without guilt. Every time you sat with discomfort instead of reaching for distraction. Every time you chose to be misunderstood rather than bend your truth. And now, they feel the shift. It's not in what you say. It's in what you no longer need. You don't need their praise. You don't need their validation. You don't even need them to stay. Because you've already chosen yourself. That scares people. But it frees you. You're not cold. You're just done performing. And the man who stops performing becomes impossible to manipulate. You're no longer swayed by guilt, no longer baited by compliments, no longer softened by the fear of being alone. Because you've already been alone. You sat in the silence that most men run from. You faced the noise that lives in your own mind. And you didn't flinch. You came back sharper, quieter, less available, and more undeniable. Now when someone enters your space, they feel it. That this is not a man who gets flattered into connection. This is not a man who fears being disliked. This is a man who knows himself and will not trade that for comfort. She can feel it in the way you pause before you speak, in the way you don't force conversation, in the way you let silence breathe between your sentences, because you've mastered the one thing that separates men who are remembered from those who are replaceable. You don't perform, you live, deliberately, aligned, unapologetically. And once you taste that, you stop trying to impress, because the man who's impressed with himself doesn't need to be liked. He needs only one thing, that his actions mirror his standard. And when they do, respect follows. Women follow. Life follows. But none of it is chaste. It's magnetized. Because presence doesn't beg. It commands. And when she says you've changed, she's finally seeing what you buried all that time in the silence. You didn't disappear. You emerged. And the world wasn't ready for that version. You weren't either. But now that you've met him, there's no going back. They'll say you're distant now. They'll say you're too quiet, too private, too serious. But what they're really noticing is that you're no longer emotionally available to nonsense. You're not angry. You're just precise. And precision feels like rejection to people who were used to your confusion. Because before, you gave everyone access. Your time, your attention, your emotional bandwidth, open doors, all of it. Now, they knock. And sometimes you don't answer. Not because you're rude, because you've realized the cost of being accessible to everything is being committed to nothing. You see the difference now. Before you'd respond to any text. Now you ask, does this serve my direction? Before you'd say yes to every plan. Now you ask, does this steal my focus or sharpen it? That's what solitude taught you. Not just who you are, but what you're not willing to be anymore. You're not the man who replies just to be polite. You're not the man who sacrifices clarity for comfort. You're not the man who explains his priorities just to be understood. That man was tired, exhausted from performing, starving for permission. You gave him a quiet death. And the man who rose in his place is allergic to distraction. It doesn't mean you hate people. It means you've filtered them. You've seen what happens when you lower your standards just to feel connected. It backfires. Every time. Because the man who trades his boundaries for acceptance ends up with neither. So now you move differently. You don't ask to be seen. You ask yourself, is this aligned? That's why your energy changed. That's why she noticed. You used to orbit others. Now you move in a straight line. Before her mood could shift your day. Now your day is so locked in, you barely notice the turbulence. Not because you're detached from emotion, but because you're no longer controlled by it. That's the real difference. You don't avoid feeling. You just refuse to be steered by it. She doesn't know what to do with that. Most people don't. Because when they can't pull you with guilt, can't bait you with chaos, can't shake you with silence, they realize they have no power, and that realization makes them uncomfortable. Not because you're cold, but because you've reclaimed your center. And once a man is centered, his presence becomes undeniable. You don't have to prove anything. You don't have to raise your voice. You don't have to justify why your standards are high. They either rise to meet them, or they fall away, and you don't flinch either way. That's the lesson most men skip. They want peace, but they're afraid of loss. They want clarity, but they're addicted to chaos. They want respect, but they keep chasing attention. It never works, because you cannot gain power from the same people you keep trying to please. They don't respect your obedience. They respect your discipline. She doesn't admire you because you're always available. She admires you when you're unavailable for anything that disrespects your time. That's when she leans in. That's when she pays attention. Not because you're playing hard to get, but because you've become hard to shake. There's no performance in your voice, no hesitation in your posture, no flinch in your silence. She doesn't see the man who needs her to choose him. She sees the man who's already chosen himself. And whether she stays or leaves, your focus remains. Because you didn't build this version of yourself to impress anyone. You built it to protect something. Your standard, your direction, your internal peace. And once you've tasted that level of control, everything else feels like noise. You stop tolerating flaky people. You stop explaining your worth. You stop making space for confusion. You sharpen your circle. You cut the slack. You walk alone, not because you hate company, but because you've learned the power of being alone with no cravings. That's why she's confused. That's why she stares a little longer now. That's why her words come slower when she speaks to you. Because you're not emotionally available to chaos. And that makes you unforgettable, not for your charm, not for your style, but for your silence, your refusal to break character, and your calm reminder that some men don't bend, they just disappear. She used to know how to get to you. A certain tone, a certain text, a little silence. You'd fold, reply fast, rush in to prove you still cared, not anymore. Now she waits longer. She checks her phone more. She notices the shift she never expected. You're no longer on call. You're on mission. Before you were available. Now you're intentional. And that energy-focused, calm, untouchable is something most women only meet once, and they never forget it, because it reveals the truth they secretly crave and deeply fear, a man who cannot be moved emotionally just to keep the peace. You don't argue now. You observe. You don't chase. You choose. And the difference is everything. It's not that you don't feel anymore. It's that you don't leak anymore. You've sealed the cracks. You've cleaned the wounds. You've learned to sit with your chaos instead of bleeding it into others. She used to get access to that chaos. She used to feel needed, wanted, central. Now she feels peripheral, not by your cruelty, but by your clarity. Because a man on mission doesn't orbit drama. He filters for alignment. And you didn't learn that from books. You learned it in silence. The long, heavy kind. The kind where the phone doesn't ring. The kind where no one checks in. The kind where your own mind turns on you. That's where the real version was forged. Alone, stripped of noise, surrounded by nothing but thoughts and accountability. You saw the games, the performance, the way you'd talk yourself into situations just to feel chosen. You saw the weakness, and you didn't flinch. You faced it. You realized you'd been negotiating your self-worth with people who never earned your vulnerability, and that disgusted you. In a good way. It was the kind of disgust that turns to discipline. That's when you started deleting, cutting the threads, saying no, not out of bitterness, but out of refinement. You cleaned your circle. You reclaimed your mornings. You restructured your values. You began acting like a man who respects his own energy. And she felt that. She didn't see it coming because most men never do it. Most men live addicted to being liked. They fear being alone, so they bend, they chase, they explain. You stopped. Now you speak less, you move slower, you say no without offering a speech. That's why she looks at you like you've changed. Because for the first time, you're not trying to be understood. You're simply being. No defense, no apology, no explanation. She says, "What happened to you?" and you just blink. Because the man who's refined his silence doesn't waste it, trying to educate those who only listened when he begged. Your power now lives in your detachment. Not coldness clarity. You don't disrespect. You just don't chase. And when someone tries to press the old buttons, there's nothing there. You've disconnected the emotional wires. Not because you're numb, because you've evolved. You're not reactive. You're not desperate. You're not moved by who stays or who leaves. That calm is terrifying to people used to controlling you, because they can't reach you anymore. You don't flinch when someone pulls away. You don't panic when texts stop. You don't break your frame to keep someone close. You simply continue. That's what makes her respect you. Even if she's angry, even if she tries to provoke, even if she walks away, because deep down she knows this is the kind of man who's not faking confidence. You're not posturing. You're not trying to get chosen. You're not working angles. You're just living by your internal compass. and that to most people is unnerving. Because now they realize the approval they used to weaponize no longer works. They can't reward you into compliance. They can't punish you into softness. Because you've already approved of yourself, you don't need her to get it. You don't need the world to agree. You just need your actions to align with your code. That's why you sleep better. That's why your movements are slower. That's why your silence hits harder than their shouting. You are no longer in emotional debt. You've paid it off. In solitude, in pain, in self-confrontation. And now, every step you take is paid in full. There's a difference between a man who is quiet because he's afraid and a man who is quiet because he's done explaining. You used to be the first. Timid, careful, trying to say the right thing so no one would leave. Now your silence says everything. You're not withholding, you're choosing. Because when a man's words become valuable to himself, he doesn't give them away easily. That's the part she can't name. She hears less from you but feels more. Every word carries weight. Every action is deliberate. Every pause reminds her that you're not performing. You used to respond just to keep her engaged. Now you respond when it's necessary, not when it's convenient for her emotions. And that discipline, that unwillingness to break your focus just to reassure someone else, is what makes you magnetic now. Not because you're trying to impress, but because your life has become too real to decorate. You're not playing anymore. You're not flirting with potential. You've turned solitude into strategy, pain into precision, confusion into code. She doesn't get the same access because you're no longer trying to prove your worth. That energy shift, she feels it like cold air in a warm room. And the more grounded you become, the more unsettled she becomes. Because she realizes something has ended. Not the connection, but the control. She used to be able to reel you back in. Now, even when she tries, it falls flat. You don't chase the conversation. You don't reach for closure. You don't need the last word. You've moved from desire to direction. And that kind of man doesn't wait to be chosen. He builds, he aligns, he filters, not because he's bitter, but because he understands one truth. A man who is clear cannot afford to be casual. That's the line most men never cross. They want peace, but keep opening the door to chaos. They want loyalty, but tolerate unpredictability. They want depth, but keep investing in shallow dynamics. And then they wonder why they feel scattered. The answer is simple. You are the sum of what you tolerate. And once you understand that your standards stop being negotiable, that's why she feels the shift. She used to expect access to you. Now it's earned. She used to expect comfort. Now she meets clarity. You've stripped away the need to be liked, and what's left is a man who can walk away without explaining why. Not as a tactic, not as a test, but as a man who has learned. That piece is expensive, and he's finally willing to pay for it. You stopped answering energy that doesn't match yours. You stopped pretending you didn't notice the red flags. You stopped making room for people who only show up when it benefits them. That's what solitude revealed. Not that you're alone, but that you were crowded by noise. Now, you speak slower because your time is organized. You move less because your direction is straight. You say less because your words no longer compete for approval. And she hears all of it in your silence. There's a presence about you now that can't be fabricated. It doesn't come from books. It doesn't come from revenge. It comes from calibration, from knowing who you are and, more importantly, who you're no longer willing to be. You used to compromise everything for connection. Now you prioritize alignment over chemistry. If it doesn't build you, let it burn. because your life isn't a stage, and you're done entertaining. Now she watches from a distance. And every time you don't react, every time you don't explain, every time you don't come running when she tugs the emotional string, it confirms the thing she hoped wasn't true. You're not the same man. She didn't lose your affection, she lost her influence. Because now, you've seen what it's like to live free of needing anyone's permission to be powerful. And once you've tasted that, you don't go back to pretending. She'll say you're harder to read now. What she means is, she no longer feels in control. Before your emotions were a script she could predict. Say the right thing, you'd light up. Say the wrong thing, you'd chase her down for clarity. Stay silent long enough and you'd break the tension first. But now, you don't. She takes longer to reply. You don't notice. She withdraws. You remain still. She flirts with detachment, and you respond with nothing, because you finally understand what most men never do. Emotional indifference isn't cruelty, it's mastery. The man who controls himself controls the room. And when a woman can no longer influence your emotional rhythm, something primal kicks in. She doesn't feel superior. She feels curiosity, then tension, then respect. Because she's so used to men who fold for validation that stillness feels like power she can't name. You're not rude, you're just centered. And in a world that rewards emotional instability, a centered man is a threat. She tests again. A joke with a bite, a cold pause mid-conversation, a shift in tone to bait a reaction. But nothing changes. You don't escalate, you don't defend, you don't mirror her mood. Because you're not reacting anymore. You're filtering. You're not wondering how she feels about you. You're watching how she handles your silence. That's the new standard. You're no longer seduced by beauty. You're measuring stability. You're observing her emotional discipline. You're reading her frame, not her words. That's what being alone taught you. How to separate chaos from character, noise from value, attention from alignment. Most men never get there. Because the second they feel tension, they rush to resolve it. They abandon their standard to buy back connection. You've done that. You've played the clown. You've over-explained yourself to people who weren't even listening. And it left you hollow. So you did the one thing men are trained to avoid. You sat still. With no reply, with no praise, with no permission. And in that stillness you found the code. Discomfort is the gate, and the men who walk through it come out with something that no one else can fake. Presence. She can't explain it, but she knows it when she feels it. When you enter a room and don't scan for validation, when you hold eye contact without performance, when your voice doesn't rise and fall based on her approval. She may not say it, but she senses it. This man isn't here to be picked. He's already chosen himself. And that changes everything. Because now connection becomes a filter, not a craving. You don't pursue to feel whole. You engage only when energy matches clarity. And she can feel the difference. You're not impressed by her curves. You're watching her composure. You're not lost in her smile. You're focused on her emotional gravity. Can she hold tension? Can she handle no without spiraling? Can she hear truth without turning defensive? If not, you don't correct her. You just continue. That's how power works. Not with volume, not with charm, but with discipline. You used to be pulled in by drama. Now it repels you. You used to adjust to keep the peace. Now you let people disqualify themselves. You're not cold. You're calibrated. You're not distant. You're discerning. And the world doesn't know what to do with that, because they're used to men who fold, not men who filter. So when she says you've changed, what she really means is you no longer negotiate with insecurity, hers, yours, anyone's. You don't explain your boundaries. You don't justify your pace. You don't apologize for moving like a man with vision, because you know where that vision was born. Not in noise, not in chaos, not in applause, in silence. The silence that burned away weakness. The silence that starved out neediness. The silence that turned approval into a distraction you no longer crave. And when you walk with that kind of stillness, you become untouchable. Not because no one can reach you, but because only the right ones ever try. There was a time when you wanted to be understood. Now, you'd rather be accurate. She asks what you're thinking. You don't soften the answer. You say it how it is, and let the silence after do the rest. Not to provoke, not to impress, but because you've spent enough time lying to yourself, and you'll never do it again, not even for connection. That's the final stage of detachment, when your truth becomes heavier than her reaction, when clarity matters more than comfort, when her feelings don't outweigh your direction. You used to flinch when a woman got quiet. Now you use that moment to measure everything. Does she handle pressure like a partner or a child? Does she retreat to control or rise in calm? Because while she's watching your reactions, you're watching her patterns. Not the ones she posts, the ones she can't fake when the tension rises. And here's what most men don't learn until they've lost years. Any woman can impress you when things are easy, but only a rare one respects you when you're firm. Only a rare one stays graceful when she's not in control. You've seen the difference. And once you've seen it, you can't unsee it. That's the curse of clarity. You'll walk through life with sharper eyes now. You'll hear the neediness behind the compliments. You'll sense the manipulation behind the softness. Because solitude didn't just make you calm, it made you accurate. Your gut used to whisper. Now it speaks. You don't need a reason to walk away. You don't need a warning to go quiet. You don't need chaos to prove your strength. You just observe. And when something isn't aligned, you don't correct it, you cut it. Because that's what a man does when he's finally leading himself. You stop rescuing people from the consequences of their own patterns. You stop coaching people who don't listen. You stop explaining truth to people who benefit from confusion. And you start living like your peace is expensive, because it is. And when you do, everything changes. Your posture, your priorities, your presence. You stop making excuses for people who drain you. You stop showing up to prove you're loyal. You stop breaking your own rules for temporary pleasure. And that kind of man is rare. She sees it. She doesn't say it, but she watches. You speak less, but she listens more. Because something about your energy makes her nervous. Not in fear, in recognition. She recognizes a man who cannot be managed. A man who doesn't need her to feel powerful. A man who won't explain the standard, but will enforce it without flinching. And that's the kind of man women talk about when they're alone. The one who didn't try to impress. The one who didn't play the game. The one who vanished the moment they tested him too far. And that's why they remember you. Because you weren't trying to be remembered. You were trying to be real. And in a world built on performance, that alone makes you unforgettable. You stopped asking what do they want from me, and started asking what aligns with my code. You stopped wondering will they leave if I speak up, and started knowing they don't belong if my truth offends them. That's not ego, that's standard, and you only find it in the quiet. Not in parties, not in likes, not in being chosen. You find it when no one's watching, and you choose yourself anyway. And the irony the second you stop needing attention is the moment everything starts gravitating toward you. Not because you're chasing, because you've become gravity. You don't beg for presence. You become presence. You don't chase love. You live so aligned that love either matches your energy or leaves. That's the shift she can't explain. That's the energy she keeps thinking about. That's the reason her new options don't feel the same. Because once she's met a man who's been through the fire of silence, a man who's led himself out of the chaos, she knows that kind of man doesn't come back. You weren't playing hard to get. You were hard to shake. You still are. And that's what happens when you stop being emotionally available to anything that doesn't respect your standard. You don't say it out loud, but the rules you live by are no longer up for discussion. She used to hear you explain yourself. Now she sees the results. You don't need to argue when your life makes the point for you. And when a man lives like that, people stop testing him with words and start watching him with silence. That's what's happening now. She used to poke, press, and provoke, hoping to get a rise, hoping to feel the power of pulling you back. But that version of you, the one who answered everything, he's gone. Not buried in bitterness, not locked away in some new mask, just retired because he served his time. He carried the weight of approval, of needing to be liked, of performing for connection, and now you know. That man was useful for survival, but useless for legacy. Legacy doesn't come from reaction, it comes from precision. And the more you refine your life, the more you realize how little deserves a reaction. That's the new rule. You don't respond to energy you didn't invite. You don't explain peace to people who live in storms. You don't bring logic to chaos and call it leadership. You used to think love meant effort. Now you understand, love without respect isn't effort, it's erosion, and you've eroded enough. Now every no you speak without hesitation is a reminder to yourself this peace wasn't free. You earned it in silence, in solitude. In the spaces where most men reach for noise, you reached inward. And you found something they didn't, stillness that doesn't collapse under pressure. You can feel it now, in the way you wake up, in the way your thoughts move clean, no stuttering, no clutter, in the way you walk into a room with nothing to prove and everything to protect. That's what she senses. That's what they all sense. That you're not indifferent. You're disciplined. You don't hate people. You've just filtered them. You don't seek attention. You've just detached from needing it. And this version of you doesn't chase answers. He builds alignment. You're not asking what you want anymore. You already know. And when a man knows deeply, brutally, unshakably knows, he becomes rare. Because most people are guessing. They live off reactions. They change based on who they're with. You used to be that man. And you know how exhausting that is. Now you're consistent. Whether she calls or not, whether the world claps or not, whether the noise flatters or attacks, your actions match your standard. And your standard doesn't adjust for applause. That's what makes her hesitate now. She's not sure if she should try again because this time, you might not give her the same grace. Not because you're vengeful, but because the man she once knew was fueled by emotion. This one is led by direction, and direction doesn't entertain loops. It cuts, it moves, it builds. That's the difference. And once a woman sees it, she realizes she can't play the same game. Not with you. Not anymore. She'll think twice before pulling away because now your silence isn't a wound, it's a wall. Not cold, not angry, just closed. Closed to the cycles. Closed to the push-pull. Closed to anything that smells like emotional instability. Because this version of you has one rule above all. If it costs your clarity, it's too expensive. And clarity has become your currency. It buys your peace. It buys your mornings. It buys the sharpness in your speech and the stillness in your eyes. And the world responds to that. Not always with applause, but always with respect. They don't know what to call it. They just know you're not like the rest. And that's enough. You're no longer explaining. You're executing. You're no longer accessible. You're selective. You're no longer emotional on command. You're emotionally sovereign. And that kind of man, he doesn't need to be understood. He needs to be obeyed by himself. And he is. You've seen what happens when you let emotions lead, when you over-explain your silence, when you hand over your peace just to avoid being misunderstood. That man didn't lose because he wasn't good enough. He lost because he gave access to people who never earned it. You gave chances where you should have given distance. You gave effort where you should have walked. You gave explanations when silence would have said more. But that season is over now. You don't chase what doesn't match. You don't entertain what doesn't align. You don't keep people around just because they remember who you used to be. Because the man you used to be no longer exists. That man needed permission. This one gives none. That man tolerated inconsistency. This one treats it like poison. That man feared being alone. This one built in it. You know what solitude really is now. It's not a punishment, it's a filter. It strips away the noise. It burns off the illusions. It puts every part of your life under a magnifying glass and asks one question: is this real? Or is this emotional survival disguised as purpose? That's the question you answered. Alone, quiet, brutally. And now, you no longer apologize for your pace. You no longer match energy, you reveal it. You no longer let people back in just because they ask. Because now the cost of your presence has gone up. Not in arrogance, in alignment. Because when you rebuild from truth, every new step feels too expensive to be shared with chaos. And she feels it. Not just her, everyone. They sense that you're not navigating the world looking to be liked anymore. You're navigating the world like a man who has seen what it costs to abandon himself and refuses to do it again. That's where your power lives now. In your refusal to shrink, in your decision to be unmoved, in your silence that cuts through emotional noise like a blade. People say you're different. What they mean is, you stopped being predictable. You stopped being emotional on cue. You stopped being accessible to low standards. And that makes you look off to people who've only known you in weakness. But to the ones who are building too, you don't look off. You look familiar. Like someone who's been through the fire and didn't just survive but chose to burn longer, to come out cleaner. That's what this was always about. Not rejection, not revenge, not detachment, refinement. The women you used to chase, feel it. The people who used to drain you, notice it. The life you used to tolerate no longer fits. Because now you've outgrown noise. And once a man outgrows noise, he stops shouting. He doesn't try to be seen. He simply builds, quietly, ruthlessly, with clarity as his compass and solitude as his training ground. You speak less because you finally trust your actions. You need less because you finally trust your direction. And you explain less because nothing real needs defending. The woman who didn't respect your softness will feel the edge of your silence. The world that only praised your performance will notice the weight of your presence. And the version of you that was once tolerated will be replaced by a version that commands space without asking. Not because you're louder, but because you're finished begging, finished proving, finished apologizing for your evolution. You don't need to be louder. You need to keep walking. Because everything that's meant for a man walking in clarity will meet him on the path he refuses to detour from. Let the world adjust. Let her adjust. Let them all notice the difference, and let them wonder why they can't reach you anymore. You're not unreachable. You're just no longer available for what broke you. Because now you walk with something few men ever find: a frame that cannot be shaken. A voice that doesn't flinch. A silence that explains everything. And a presence that says only one thing without words. He's not who he was. And he's never going back. You didn't watch this to be entertained. You watched because you felt it. That shift, that silence, that version of you who finally stopped performing. If that version is waking up inside you, leave a comment. Mark the moment you stopped bending. Say nothing clever, just say, "I've chosen myself." Because the man who names the shift owns it. And if this isn't just content to you, if it's a mirror, a reminder, a code, then hit subscribe. Because we're not here to win attention, we're here to protect alignment. And every man building in silence needs one truth at his back. You don't need to be louder, you just need to stop folding. Stillness isn't absence, it's armor, and here we wear it with pride.